This is section 6 of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I'd like to start with comparing the Mariner in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner with John Newton's hymn, which is a bit of a icon for many in the West, Amazing Grace. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Now, that way of thinking sets and puts in place a polarity that one makes an immediate transition from grace versus wretch, blind seeing, and it's almost like in many ways if I turn in a certain direction, all my problems, all my struggles, all my internal issues are magically like snake oil or silver bullet healed. And that amazing grace as a hymn has become a standard hymn for many in the West, and for Newton himself as a slave trader in his early life. It's understandable as he moved from that position to becoming an Anglican priest eventually. But Amazing Grace is a hymn, given its impact on the evangelical and significant elements of Reformed theology, which has shaped the evangelical world, have played a significant role in informing how people understand experience, the experience of transformation, the experience of knowing themselves, the experience of dealing with the albatrosses that, in fact, they have killed in life. And to think that somehow, because it has dropped off like lead into the sea, therefore the difficult aspects of the human journey are gone and over. It runs foreign to much of the Western philosophical tradition, in which there is the agon, the struggle, and there is antagonists and there is protagonists on the journey, as the Greeks understood only so clearly and as the best element of the Christian contemplative tradition saw so clearly, succinctly. Now, with the mariner, we do know the albatross has fallen into the sea, but does that mean that the mariner himself is being blown home clear across good waters, a blue canopy sky, and there is no problems in reaching the fair country where the kirk and the lighthouse are? Or does, in fact, his experience stay with him like a monkey on the back? Is the memory ever with him of what he has done, not only in the albatross, but other things in his life, as in most people? Just because someone is making a change in their life towards the good, towards the better, towards more meaningful life, does that mean what they have done in the past, the memories of what they have in the past that are stored in the cupboards of their mind, disappear? Now, the mariner says in section 6 of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, like one that on a lonely road. Now, the albatross has fallen off his back. Does that mean loneliness is gone? Does that mean those on the ship that he has been with are in harmony once again? The relationships have been restored. Like one that on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread. He still knows fear. He still knows dread. And so, obviously, one aspect of what he has done seems to have been dealt with, but there are much deeper things in his life, multiple albatrosses, both the dark side of the albatross and the positive side of the albatross, that still brings on fear and dread. So fear and dread don't go away in a person's journeys, doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. And so the memory of the mariner, even though the albatross in that sense has dropped, there are many other albatrosses in the inner life that don't magically disappear because someone deals with one albatross that they have killed. There's multiple albatrosses within the soul and within society itself. And so Coleridge in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, unlike Newton, in Amazing Grace, recognizes only too acutely and only too clearly that, as Chaucer would say, the leaf so short, the craft so long to learn it. The life is so short, but the craft of self-understanding, of insight, of transformation, that takes a long time to grapple with. Unfortunately, there is a form of Christianity One gets it in Newton's hymn to some degree, but like the Billy Graham tradition, the born again experience, one comes to the altar and then seemingly all life's troubles dissipate like a cloud that passes through the sky, and the blue canopy appears. That's not what life is like. We probably are more attentive to what William Blake is: joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. And this is what Coleridge understands and the mariner understands in his ongoing journey. And if one is not acutely aware that there is this, as Goethe probably articulated in a clearest way, two beings wrestle for my soul. We get this in Plato as well, Goethe drawing from Plato in many ways. And to think that one, the darker side, the problematic side, the narcissistic side, the egoistic side just magically disappears because we've dealt with one addiction, one troubling element of our personality. Coleridge, like Blake, would say, no, that's not the nature of the journey itself. And to those who think things disappear because we've dealt with an element in ourselves, other creatures will raise their heads, and we have to deal with those things also. And so, to the degree a person is willing to recognize that all the good things in life can be tainted if a person is not aware, and acutely so, of this negative, this dark side of their personality, what Christians would call the sinful side, but we today would call the narcissistic, the egoistic element. T.S. Eliot, in one of his great works of drama, Becket's Murder in the Cathedral. Becket goes on to be Archbishop of Canterbury in his clash with Henry II, and Becket has a sensitive, inward, probing side, and he became acutely aware in his clash with Henry. There's a lovely quote amongst many. He says, those who claim to make the greater cause often make the cause serve them. And we can see how in significant elements of religion, of which Coleridge is grappling with, of which Newton is grappling with, of which many people are trying to make sense of in the areas of spirituality, the contemplative, the meditative way, we often, if we don't deal with those elements of ourselves, we can use a good and twist that good to serve our own self-centered temperaments and personalities. Bertolt Brecht, the great German writer, said, as terrible is the temptation to do good. Terrible is the temptation to do good. So goodness, like religion, like politics, like many things in life, education, people's interest in justice, people's interested in peace, many fine and important things, but if the problematic element in a person is not dealt with, or multiple elements, Walt Whitman says, I have multitudes within me. And if people aren't willing to deal with those multitudes within, that can become very destructive. And there's also the good side of those as well. But particularly the dark side of the multitudes, the good that they turn to, they will twist it to serve their self-centered ends. Shakespeare says, some by virtue fall, and others by vice rise. And so what Coleridge is getting at here in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, section 6, is beware on the journey of what lingers in our soul, what is in rooms perhaps we don't want to open, places we don't want to go to. This is why the last part of it, as the mariner is heading slowly, and it's a journey, this is an important element to pick up in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as he grapples with one albatross he's killed, but it is still a journey homeward, and that takes time. One cannot rush in, one cannot in haste think that these difficult issues will be settled and sorted out quickly. And so section 6 really deals with the journey, and the final part of it, of that journey, the mariner increasingly heads into the bay and into the cove again, and he meets the hermit who's come out in a boat to meet him. And it ends with, I saw a third, I heard his voice, it is the hermit good. He singeth loud his godly hymns. It might add that the godly hymns of the hermit would certainly not be Amazing Grace of Newton. That he makes in the wood, he'll shrieve my soul, he'll wash away the albatross's blood. Now, within the Anglican tradition, certainly in the Lenten tradition, you have Shrove Tuesday, which then leads people into Lent. And to be shriven is to be, there's confession, there's usually penance and then absolution. And to be shriven in that sense is to be forgiven, to be exonerated, to be said things are fine again now. But one has to go through the journey of confession. Often when people don't confess those elements in their lives which are dark, which are troubling, which are problematic, which can lead them to various painful places. When they repress elements and there's no one to talk up to them about it, no one to confess it to them, this is when things build up psychologically within a person. But in confessing, it's a cathartic experience. And then, of course, forgiveness or absolution, and for some, there's penance. If someone has hurt someone, sadly and tragically so, the question is so what are you going to do to bring amends? To bring healing again in a painful situation. And so as the mariner gradually heads home, which is a long experience and journey itself with those on the ship, again, the mariner and what Coleridge is up to, the journey is never about the lone individual, about the individual in the context of a community, a parish, a people. And so choices by one have a ripple effect and impact on others. Our decisions are not made in a way that don't have any influence on other people. The mariner's choice had an immense impact on those he was knit together with. And of course, the restoration of those relationships is part of journey. But it's significant that as the mariner heads closer to home in this long journey, he's guided, interestingly, by seraphs, the bright light of seraphs. And one of the important metaphors which runs through section 6 is the moon. And there are three within the classical tradition, the Platonic tradition. There are three levels of light. There's the sun, which is the brightest, which no one can look into without being blinded. The moon is the lesser light. It's not the greater light, but the moon, depending on its phases in its orbit itself, can provide a greater or a lesser and lesser light. And there are the stars themselves, which are lesser lights itself. And Coleridge, being a Platonic Anglican, probably one of the most significant Platonic Anglicans in his time, drew deeply from the well of Plato and understood various levels of light. And so as the mariner is heading home, yes, light is emerging. There's the moon increasingly guiding him in the soul. But the moon in all of its fullness and all of its light has not quite guided in all of its richness where the mariner might go. But the light of the moon is bringing his home. It's more than just the light of the stars, which Coleridge has mentioned earlier in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but it certainly is not the light of the sun, which illuminates the mariner and those on the ship with himself. So he's still living in, because one is in the night with the moon, there is still much shadow, there is still much darkness. Before dawn comes and then day comes. And so section 6, this constant refrain of the moon, it's probably the most dominant metaphor in section 6 of the Rime of the Ancient Metaphor, is that moon and shadow, shadow and moon, play off one another. Neither are the fullness of light, neither are the richness of the day. We don't have the luxury, the access to the fullness of the day in section 6. And this is why the moon becomes a secondary level. But the minimal light of the moon is least enough to guide the mariner and his ship closer to home, but it is still a world of shadow and darkness in which he's navigating his way back to the cove from what is home. We will pick up on this in section 7. But there are also guides on this journey. The seraphs become a very important metaphor for him. They're bright light which is shining, a brighter light than the moon itself. And so there are those beings that can come to people on their journey, that when the moon does not provide the light needed to find the cove and to find home again, there are those beings, the communion of the saints, more than greater than the saints, the bright lights, the torches of the seraphs themselves, that Coleridge was acutely aware of, that guide the mariner homeward, where the moon is insufficient. and the moon and the shadows play with one another in the soul and in society itself. So section 6 begins, well, it doesn't begin, it continues in many ways the nature of the homeward journey, but the homeward journey is not automatically done because the albatross falls off the neck of the mariner. Important to note too for Coleridge, there are, as I've mentioned earlier, there are many, many mariners and many albatrosses as well. It's not like one albatross, we figured it out, therefore we are on our way home. It's interesting, when I was young, I spent time in Coleridge's first place he lived in with his wife Sarah in Netherstowey, where he and Wordsworth, Dorothy and William lived, and I often walked the trail back and forth that Coleridge and Sarah and Dorothy and William were. And then they moved up to the Lake District, Keswick. Coleridge was up there, and then when his marriage came unhinged with Sarah, he moved down to Highgate. It's the high area in London. Actually, the big cemetery there is where Karl Marx is buried as well. I've spent some lovely time at that large cemetery. But Coleridge is buried in the church, the parish in Highgate. And it's interesting, the epigraph on his funeral stone, his tombstone, it says, "Stop, Christian passerby, stop, child of God." And in many ways, the mariner, as he grabbed the wedding guest, it was about stopping to see what's going on within the self, within the soul, within the shadows and the moon, stopping to see what's happening in society itself, and not being taken captive by the trendy of any given time, the changes of the seasons, not surfing the wave of what's coming and will disappear very shortly, the clouds that come and go of hot button issues of the culture wars, but stop. And so at the end of his life and the beginning of his life, Coleridge is doing what he can to hold us, to hold each person, because in this sense, the mariner is the one who reaches out to everyone on their journey and says, "Stop. I want to tell you a story, and this story is important to hear in terms of the nature of the human pilgrimage through time, and becoming acutely aware, sensitive, attentive, and attuned to what is going on in the inner life at both crude and subtle levels, and knowing how to deal with that on the journey of life, and finding our way home again." And so as the mariner holds the wedding guest, and in that sense the poem is addressed, we are all, in a sense, the wedding guest that the mariner holds. And so the beginning of Coleridge's life and the end of his life, it's the stop and see. Stop and be aware of what's going on within and without. This is why psychology is very important, and this is why politics is very important. Because if we don't know how to see properly, which we only begin to see properly through stopping and seeing, then often choices are made in life that lead to hurt, to harm, not only for the self, but for community, in relationships, politically at larger levels. And then the cynicism, the skepticism that emerges in people's lives when they feel betrayed, when they have trusted idealistically in a person or an idea, and then in fact it turns on them, Judas-like, and then the tendencies, who can I trust again? Why should I trust anything? And so right at the beginning of Coleridge's first, probably one of his most important works, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, he grabs the wedding guest, and at the end it stops. So before making decisions, both young and in middle age, in the spring season of life, the summer and the autumn, stop meditatively, contemplatively, and then see what needs to be seen, so that in the acting, in the choosing, it is wise, it is discerning, and it is good, and there will not be regrets, rather than acting out of bloated appetites or misguided desires, and then the implications that can occur in people's life in terms of the suffering and the tragedy that can follow as a consequence of that. And so section 6 in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a very, very important one for a whole variety of reasons in terms of the nature of the human journey, the pilgrimage through time, being acutely aware that these issues are not solved magically, but in fact it's by attentiveness. It's like Socrates says, know yourself, or Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. And that itself is a journey. For what is the self? Given often the multiple voices that can speak within, and how do we find that still point in the moving world that Eliot talks about in the four quartets. And so section 6 then brings us into 7, very significant that 7, Coleridge is working out of anyone who's aware of the book of Genesis and the Bibles is the 7th day. The 7th day is the day of rest. And so when we hit 7, Coleridge is drawing the 7th day. Section 7 in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, day 7 in the Bible is the Sabbath. It's the place of rest. In some, the interesting that Eliot in the Ash Wednesday, there is no 7th section. For him, there is an openness and uncertainty about what that might be, whereas in Coleridge, we can see that he is following the motif or the myth of the biblical 7 days, and the seventh is the day of rest. Just one final note is I'm teaching a course this semester for St. Stephen's on the Inklings, and often when people teach the Inklings, they move from MacDonald to Barfield to Tolkien to Lewis, William, sometimes Dorothy Sayers, and then Roger Lancel and Green, the orphaned Inkling, without realizing that back of all of these people is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge believed very strongly in an age of scientism and rationalism that in fact that was an inadequate and very limited way of knowing, but where there was the purified imagination and the role of myth in imagination, this was the unconcealer of what is good, true, and beautiful. So back of the Inklings is Coleridge, and to understand the Inklings, one has to understand the rigorous philosophical work that Coleridge engaged in the Sibylline Leaves, in his Biographia, and many of these other works. And the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is his first significant ballad that really is suggesting that imagination and myth can open up recesses in the human soul that a purely narrow rationalism and empiricism can never get to. And so it is these deeper probes that imagination and story can open up, which the rhyme is in many ways the key and the ignition of which Coleridge will develop his thinking much more significantly and substantively in his ongoing philosophical work. So number 6, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we shall move into how Coleridge brings this to an end in section 7, which we will get to in the next reflection.